The Enterprise Stack walkthrough video. We will take a look at how you can set up the Enterprise Stack on your local system to do a credential issuance and also a credential verification. We will start off with the Quickstart, which is a repository you can use to get easily started with the Enterprise API on your local system. Important to note here, you only can access the Enterprise API if you are an enterprise customer of walt.id. Once we have the stack up and running, we will start to create an admin account. And then using this admin account to create our first organization, which is a general wrapper for all the different tenants and services the enterprise stack can then host. After the organization creation, we create an API key and assign an admin role. After that, we create a tenant, and inside of this tenant, we can then launch different enterprise services, like the KMS Service for managing keys for the issuer API to sign credentials, an issuer service to issue credentials, a status service to manage status credentials so that with the issuer API, we can issue a credential that has a revocation status. And then we also set up the Verifier API to then also verify these credentials. Next to the Enterprise API in this video, I have set up on my local machine a wallet API with a front end, so we can actually then see how the issued credential looks like in a holder perspective. Here we see a tree-like structure of the different resources we will be creating in the upcoming sections. Let's now go over and start with the Quickstart guide. Here I'm at the walt.id Enterprise Quickstart repository. I will now clone this onto my local machine. Here in my terminal, I will now clone this repository, change into it, and now we can run the walt.id Enterprise Stack API. If we now take a quick look here in the repository itself, we can see we have the Docker Compose file, we have an environment file, which holds information about the MongoDB database. So in order for the Enterprise Stack to store data like issuance request, username, passwords, and other kinds of data, it uses a MongoDB database. And when starting the Enterprise Stack later with the Docker Compose, we will not only start the Enterprise API, but also start a local MongoDB database, which the Enterprise Stack can then connect to. And also here we have the Enterprise API Docker image version, which will be used in the Docker Compose. Next to that, we have different types of configurations. So for example, we have the feature configuration where you can enable and disable certain features of the Enterprise Stack. You can also check out the walt.id Enterprise docs to see which features are enabled by default and which ones are available in general and can be enabled optionally. Also, we have the auth config, which configures different types of settings like signing key, verification key for auth tokens. You can also set certain expiration dates for the sessions that are created. Here we have a database configuration and then the enterprise configuration where we set things like the base URL. And then we also have the super admin registration configuration, which becomes interesting for us later when we start off to create our first account using a super admin token, which is defined right here. But now let's first run the Enterprise Stack service. Here in my terminal, I will just type Docker Compose up to bring up the different services. And once this is up and running, we can start accessing the Enterprise API. And here I'm now at the browser and open up the Enterprise API by going to enterprise.localhost, which is specified here in the enterprise conf file. Now, the first step will be that we register a super admin user. This is typical when you set up the Enterprise Stack the first time. And you will have in your environment this super admin registration configuration file where you can specify then different types of tokens which can then be redeemed for super admin accounts. So in our example here, we have this token, specifies also an expiration time, and it has here an account. So we say, okay, we want the identifier to be this email address and we want the password to be this password, which we can then later use after we have registered the super admin to log in as a user with super admin rights. So I will just copy this token here and go back to the API. So here in the API, I can now go to the super admin endpoints and say create super admin by token. So I paste this token from the configuration file and execute. Now the super admin account was created and I can now use it with the password and the email specified to log in. So we will go about and just do that. So here, account authentication. We will provide our login information from the config file and log in as a super admin. Now with the super admin, I will create the first organization in which we can then launch different types of tenants and in the tenants and different services. So here I go to this create organization endpoint and create my first organization. I will call it walt.id and let's create it. Now I have the organization created. What is special about it is that from now on, we will operate in a subdomain of our current domain, because each organization that gets created gets its own subdomain automatically. It's based on the ID we provide here when creating the organization. So here I will go now to walt.id.enterprise.localhost, which means from now on, I'm operating inside of the walt.id organization. Here, first thing, I will log in again with my super admin account. And now we can go ahead and create our first API key, which we can then use thereafter to do operations. I will create an API key with admin rights for the walt.id organization, which means it can only do operations inside of walt.id. But I could also make the rights more targeted. So it can only do certain types of operations, maybe only in specific tenants or services inside of the walt.id organization. But for the simplicity's sake, let's just go with an admin account in this example. So I will go to the APIs endpoints and now create the first API key. What's interesting now is that we have this target parameter. The target parameter specifies the resource in which we will operate, and when creating a resource, it also specifies the ID of the new resource. So for example, when we are now creating an API key, we create it in the walt.id organization, and we can give it a custom ID, like first API key. So this part here is arbitrary, which means we can decide how we want to call it. So I will call it first API key. Then in the body, I provide a name and let's execute. This API key now doesn't have any roles associated with it. So roles are just a wrapper or a container of different types of permissions, like create organization, create issuer service, create issuance request. When creating an organization like we did before creating the walt.id organization, in the background there's automatically also a role created that is an admin role for that specific organization called organization name.admin. So in our example, this would be walt.id admin. And I will now use this role and assign it to this specific API key. But first, I will also save my API key for further reference. So here we will now assign a role to an API key. We will specify the role in the target and then the API key we want to assign it to. And now we have an API key with the admin role. I will now use this API key to authenticate. So now going back here to this overview, we now created our first organization and now have also credentials so we can do operations inside of that organization. So the next step would be, let's create a tenant. So we can then create different services. So back at the API, we can now create our first tenant. So here we will go in the service resource section and create our first tenant. Here again in the target, we first specify the organization we want to create a tenant in, and then an arbitrary tenant ID. In my case, that's tenant 1. In the body, I just provide a human readable name. Now we have our tenant. So let's go further and start creating our first enterprise service. For that, we will use the services/create endpoint. And we will start off with a KMS service, because this is the basis which we then need for other services, like the issuer service or the credential status service. And so let's create our first KMS. Now, looking back here at this document, we see that a service is inside of a tenant, which means we now specify in the target not only the organization, but also the tenant in which we want to create a service, because we could potentially have multiple tenants and therefore could create it in different ones. So we specify here walt.id as the organization, then our tenant we just created, and now again an arbitrary ID for the service we are about to create. I will just call it KMS1. Now I execute this and we have our first KMS service. And let's now use this service to create different types of keys we can then use in the issuer service and the credential status service. Going here to our key management service, we can now generate a set of keys. And here again, in the target, we now need to specify not only the organization and the tenant, but also the service in which we want to create that key. And then, of course, we also specify again the key ID we want to have. In the body, I will just leave it as, specifying that I want to use just the regular database or the MongoDB database as a storage of the keys. And I also specify the key type I want to create. Now, this backend, so using the MongoDB as a storage for the keys, is great for building like first use cases, but it's not recommended for production. In production, keys should be stored in a secure environment. And that's why we also offer different types of KMS integration, so key management services like AWS KMS, Azure Key Vault, Oracle, and other cloud platform providers. And if we now look at an AWS example, we can see that here we not only specify the backend as being AWS, so that we use the external integration and the key type, we also specify a config file with auth tokens so that the walt.id Enterprise API can communicate with AWS to create the keys in a secure environment. This configuration file we now provide here in the key generation request itself, but it can actually also be provided when setting up the KMS service itself. And this way, when you provide it at the service creation level, it will automatically be inferred here, which means I could just leave out this config object, specify only that I want to use the external KMS, AWS KMS, and the key type. And then in the background, it will take the configuration from the service configuration we provided at the beginning. But now back to the basic example. So I will use here the regular backend, so the MongoDB database and the key type ed25519. So let's create that. I now have a key, but I also not only need an issuer key, so for the issuer service we will later create, but I also need one for the status service. So for the status service, I also create another key pair. Next, we need also some DIDs for the keys we just created. So DIDs we can then use as an issuer DID when issuing credentials, but also for the status credential service. When we issue a status credential, we need also an issuer DID. So for both keys, we now need DIDs. But before we can create DIDs, we need, of course, another service, which is the DID service. So going back to our resources, let's create a did service. Here in the target, again, I specify walt.id as an organization, tenant 1 is the tenant I want to create the service in, and then a specific ID I decided upon for the did service itself. So now we have our did service, and we will now generate a did key for our keys we created before. So first, pretty similar, we will specify here in the target the organization, the tenant, and then the did service we want to create a did in. But as of the current date, the enterprise deck cannot store the did documents, which means there is no need for a specific ID for the document, which means we will just need to provide here the service, so the did service identifier, and in the body we will provide the key ID for which we want to create did. Now, because it's not stored, this did document and the did that was created, we will now need to save the did ourselves for later reference. So I will quickly save it, and also creating the key for the status service. So I also created this did here, and I will also save that for future reference. Okay, so now we have our dids. Let's move on to the issuer service itself. So I will provide here the target with the organization, the tenant, and then the issuer service ID, and the body for the creation of the issuer service. If we look at the body, we see first we specify the KMS and the token ID of the key that should be used for signing tokens during the credential exchange. And what we do here is we first need to specify the KMS service of the walt.id enterprise where the key is stored. So in this case, walt.id tenant 1 KMS1. And then we need to specify the token key ID, which is the key that should be used for signing tokens during exchange. Next to that, we need to provide a map of supported credentials this issuer can issue. This is not something that we can't change later, so we can always update that after we've created the issuer service. But for this example, as we will be issuing an EID credential, I already provided this here in the supported credential types. So here I specified that I want to have an EID credential issuable in the format short VC JSON, so a W4C credential, and specifying some cryptographic binding methods, signing algorithms, and credential definition itself with the type. You can also learn more about how this is structured in our documentation at docs.walt.id /enterprise stack. And based on these settings, I will now create that issuer service. Now that we have the issuer service created, we will also just go ahead and create a credential status service. And here I will create the credential status service, so the type, and then we have different types of registries you can use to host the status credential. So the status credential is a credential that needs to be hosted publicly so that verifiers can access it and also then check the status of different types of credentials that were issued. And so we offer different types of external registries you can use to host these status credentials. One being Azure, then AWS S3, and also Google Cloud. So these different providers. I will be going with the Azure registry. Then, as a last step, I will create a verifier service. So similar procedure. And here in the body, I will just provide a base URL, which should reflect the URL I'm hosting this under. So we now also have the verifier service set up, And now we can go ahead and use those different services. So first, before we can issue a credential, we need to use the credential status service to specify a credential status configuration. Because at the end, there are different types of statuses you could use. The most basic one being revocation. And so in the status service, we now create a configuration for a status credential. When creating the configuration, the status credential itself is not yet issued. It's only being issued when the first status inside of the status credential is created. So for example, when we later use the issue API to create a credential with a revocation status where we specify the configuration we are now creating, then on basis of this configuration, we now specify a status credential gets issued and then hosted via the specified registry, in our case Azure, so that then verifiers can access it when verifying credentials. So here we now specify, first of all, the organization, the tenant, then the specific service we want to create the configuration in, and then the configuration ID. In the body, we specify, first of all, the key ID, which is the key that should be used to sign the status credential when it's issued. So we specify our status service key, and then the DID, which I saved earlier, I will insert here. Then in the configuration, we specify the purpose, in our example, revocation, then the type of status credential, so the standard, in our case, status list 2021, the status size being 1, and the 2 different statuses that are possible, which are unset and set. So not revoked and revoked. And with that, I will execute this, and we now have our first config created. And so now we come to the step where we issue our first credential. So now going to the issuer service and to the credential/issue endpoint, we can now issue our first credential. So first I will specify the target. So I specify the organization, the tenant, and the issuer service I want to use to issue a credential. Here I don't need a specific ID because the session ID, the OID session ID for the credential exchange will be auto-created. And in the body, I provide the credential data I want to issue. So here I specify first the issuer key ID, which is an issuer key we created before in the KMS service in the enterprise stack. Then I quickly need to get my DID, which I saved earlier for reference. So I can insert that here. Then I need to specify the credential configuration ID, which refers to the ID we set up at the beginning. So when we created the issuer service, we specified that we want to have an EID issuable with in the chart we see JSON format. And then we have the credential data, which is the regular W3C credential data structure with a credential subject, a type, a context, and so on. Also, we have the mapping function here, so as it is in the walt.id community stack. And now a bit special, we have our status. So here we say, okay, we want to issue this W3C credential with a status. And this can then connect, so the issuer service of the enterprise stack can then connect with the credential status service we created earlier of the enterprise stack to then issue a credential with a status. And what we need to specify here is first the configuration ID we created earlier, and the initial status being here not revoked. Also, we use the authentication method pre-authorize, so the pre-authorize flow, and the draft 13 OID for VC protocol version. Also, we say, okay, this credential offer will expire in 300 seconds. With that, we can now execute this and get back this regular OpenID for VC offer URL, which I will now use with the wallet I also have run locally to receive the credential. So I will paste it here in the wallet and receive that EID credential. When we open this EID credential now in the wallet, we can see that it has this credential status. Also, what we could do is view that. So we could now go to the status credential public endpoint and access it by accessing it via our URL. This will download a chart. And if we now open this chart and paste it here in chart.io, we see the credential, the status credential, which is stored at the public endpoint with this encoded list here, which holds the different statuses of various types of credentials. And also, we can see here that, for example, this credential specifically, so the status of this credential is on the index 485 in this encoded list here. But now let's go ahead and verify this credential. So what we will do here is we go first to the Verifier API. Here we first need to specify the target, and then in the body we will specify the credential request. So we say the format of the credential we want to request is short VC JSON, the type of the credential is EID, and the policies we want to apply next to the default policies like the schema policies is the revoked status list policy to check that the credential is not yet revoked. So when we execute this, we get back our regular OpenID for VP URL, which we can then now pass to the wallet. And here we see, okay, we are about to present the EID credential we just issued. So we just close that. And we can also see that the presentation was successful. If we now go back to the Enterprise API and go here, so we have here the state value. And this we can use to access the session via this sessions.view endpoint by providing here the target, where the target is the organization, the tenant, and the service, and then here at the back the ID of the OIDC session. So if we execute this, we can inspect the results of the presented credential and can see here that the signature policy was applied and was successful, and we can also see here at the bottom that the credential status list policy was applied and it is not yet revoked. So what we will do next, we will revoke our credential. So back at the credential status service, we will use the status credential status update endpoint. First, what we will do is we will specify the configuration of the status credential. And in the body, we need to first provide the index we want to update in the status credential. So this we can also see here. So it's this 485. And so if I provide this index here and the new status being the revoked status, I execute this. So we updated the credential. And what happens here is that it takes the credential, the status credential, it updates the bit string with the different statuses of different credentials, updates the specific index, and then it reissues the credential and hosts it again at the endpoint we specified via the Azure cloud. So now that I have updated the status, we will do another verification. So again, in the verifier, we will do the same request we did before. And here in the wallet, when I'm now presenting this credential, we see that the presentation has failed. And if we now inspect the details of this verification request, we will see that the credential has been revoked. So the policy revoked status list failed. And with that, we saw an end-to-end use case. So setting up the enterprise stack the first time, creating an organization, a tenant, and different services, and then issuing a credential with a status to a wallet, then revoking that credential and verifying both that it was valid before it was revoked and then after that it was invalid after we revoked the credential. In the description, you will find first the link to the enterprise stack documentation to dive deeper into all of these concepts. Also, you find a link to this walt.id Enterprise Quickstart Guide so you can get started right away. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Also make sure to leave us a star on GitHub if you enjoy our tools. And with that, happy building and see you next time.